agrees, I think we should get started. Welcome everyone from all over to the first of our Palestine-focused webinars from Mass Peace Action. We're honored today to have Palestinian guests from a variety of Palestinian communities in the Middle East and here in the US. As you all know, Palestine has been suffering for many years under occupation, displacement, Israeli colonialism, and now apartheid that is imminently being more entrenched by the annexations that the current Israeli government is planning in the West Bank. Here in the US and a lot of other wealthier countries, we may have reached the peak or the plateau of coronavirus, but among Palestinian communities and the less wealthy and underdeveloped countries around the world, they may be just at the early phases of the pandemic. And on top of all the other difficulties faced by those communities, it could be a real catastrophe, another catastrophe on top of the catastrophes that Palestinians have suffered over the years. So I'm going to, in a moment, introduce our panelists and let them explain who they are and where they are. But before that, I just want to wish our Muslim friends who are observing Ramadan a blessed Ramadan, and apologies for those who are fasting. This webinar is coming just at the point of sunset in the Middle East, when people would normally be heading out to their breaking the fast, the iftar. So apologies for that. We didn't think to do it a little bit earlier. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. We have one from the West Bank, one from Gaza, one from the Palestinian communities within 1948 Israel, and we hope, if the technical difficulties are overcome, someone from the Palestinian refugee communities in Beirut. These are the four large Palestinian communities in the Middle East. And of course, we have Nidal also representing the larger Palestinian diaspora outside of the Middle East as well. So I'm going to pass it on to Lubnah. And Lubnah, you can introduce yourself briefly and explain what your situation is in Bethlehem and what people are facing there in the light of the current political situation and the threat of the coronavirus pandemic. So Lubnah, please go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for this, and thanks for hosting this webinar. I'd like to say good evening to everyone who has joined us, or good afternoon, whatever the case may be. My name is Lubnah Shomali. I am calling in from Bethlehem in the West Bank. I work for an organization, a human rights organization called BADIL Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. As I mentioned, we are a human rights organization that specializes in contemporary and historic forcible transfer of the Palestinian people. So looking at the displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people as early as 1917 with the occupation by the British, of course the 1948 Nakba and catastrophe, the occupation of the rest of Palestine in 1967, all the way up until today. One thing I will say about this pandemic, there have been, I would say, two main impacts. In an existing regime of oppression, discrimination, and apartheid, such as the one created and sustained by Israel over the Palestinian people, a global health crisis like this has shown that it is an opportunity, let's say, for Israel to exacerbate the institutionalized discrimination and human rights violations that they perpetuate against the Palestinian people. And the second thing is that it allows other opportunities. It's the perfect cover, let's say, for Israel to exploit and further entrench this regime. And we were talking before we actually started this webinar about how this pandemic is a cover to further impose on Palestinians the confiscation of their lands and further annexation. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. The most vulnerable populations, I would say, are those that have experienced the brunt of the apartheid regime. So we often see in situations like this that people who are already marginalized, already facing oppressive regimes and discriminations, are the ones that face the brunt of a situation like this. And for Palestinians, I would say that the three most impacted communities, Palestinian communities, are refugees, both here and abroad, because Palestinian refugee camps are, of course, among the most densely populated and crowded. And the majority of their inhabitants are already suffering from inadequate economic and living conditions, giving rise to a humanitarian crisis. So they're already in dire straits. And this is particularly the case, of course, in Lebanon and the Gaza Strip. I'm not going to talk in detail about these areas, but if we recall the situation in Lebanon, we already have a sectarian government that is barely holding things together and experiencing a severe economic crisis. There is already institutionalized discrimination against Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and there was the recent uprisings that occurred because of the Lebanese demonstrations and revolutions. So they're already a marginalized group, and this, of course, exposes even more vulnerabilities and exposes them to more human rights violations. The third group, I would say, are Palestinian prisoners and workers. Particularly when we're talking about workers, those who are from the West Bank that work inside 1948 Palestine. And then, of course, Palestinians in 1948 Palestine and Palestinians in Jerusalem. So in terms of the opportunities or providing the perfect cover for Israel to exploit this regime or to use the crisis, since Israel confirmed its first case of COVID-19 on the 21st of February, the Israeli civil administration had demolished 69 structures in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. This resulted in the forcible displacement of 63 people and affected
I hope we haven't lost Lubnah. You back?
Yes, we did.
We lost her for a minute.
Sorry, a call came in and I guess it disconnected. Apologies. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Go ahead.
Okay, apologies.
you're all set to keep going.
Yeah, so as I said, since Israel confirmed its first case of COVID-19 on the 21st of February, there were 69 structures in the West Bank demolished. And this resulted in the displacement of 63 people and affected another 417. These structures included 28 residential properties and 7 water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities. Interestingly enough, a third of those structures were provided by international humanitarian aid relief. So they were provided by international donors, okay? So what Israel has done in this case is, even in telling people to stay home and enhancing the militarization and securitization of the West Bank and other areas as well, they have used this to actually further entrench and enhance the coercive environment that leads to forcible displacement. The imposed quarantine and the tightening of the borders also entrenches the de facto annexation of Area C of the West Bank and facilitates the implementation of Trump's so-called vision for peace. If we follow what happened in April, we had the creation of a new Israeli coalition government on the 20th of April between Gantz and Netanyahu. And they reached an agreement, and it also includes a framework, a clause within the agreement that says that they are going to fulfill or adhere to the peace plans as much as possible. Of course, this is a very wide reference, but it clearly, from what we have heard from Israeli politicians, they're clearly referring to Trump's proposed vision for peace, and they want to implement the annexations outlined there. And they even set a date that this could potentially happen. There could be a vote in the Knesset. They will be able to vote on unilateral annexation legislation as early as the 1st of July. Naturally, what's happening in Palestine is also happening around the world. What we are seeing is heightened militarization and securitization, including mass surveillance that is implemented under the guise of a state of emergency. Here, what we see is particularly the tightening of the closures and the existing checkpoints. And there is no reason to believe that once the so-called pandemic is under control, once the virus or there is no longer a case of emergency, it is highly likely that we will continue to see the extension of these closures. And Israel has a particular history with this. Throughout the occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, Israel initiated most of the legal and physical barriers that keep us out of so-called Israeli areas as temporary measures, much like the measures that they have induced during this current state of emergency, and then never removed them. One example is that during the 1991 Gulf War, the permit regime for Palestinians leaving Gaza and the West Bank going to Jordan, that permit regime was installed and never removed during the first Gulf War. So there were also so-called temporary measures implemented during the Second Palestinian Intifada in 2000, and we still have those measures in place. So what has happened is that these closures have further isolated vulnerable communities in Area C from local markets, from being able to farm and see to their crops, because we are in the spring right now. And so they have crippled their capacity to earn a living. We've also seen greater freedom and impunity for colonizer violence and illegal land possession through squatting. So what happens is that colonizers from the different colonies in the West Bank will select a piece of Palestinian land and go squat on it and claim it as their land, and will end up staying there because there is no force or there is impunity for them to stay there, because the Israeli security system or the Israeli military provides them with protection. Also, there has been an 80% surge in attacks by Israeli colonizers in the last 2 months. This is an 80% surge from the first 2 months of the year. So in January and February, we didn't have this situation, but since the pandemic or the closures and the quarantine started in March and April, this is when we have seen this surge. I'd just like to go back to, am I doing okay on time?
You've got about a minute.
Okay. I just want to go back and highlight the situation with Palestinian refugees. Theoretically, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, is the agency responsible for providing humanitarian aid and assistance to Palestinian refugees. So this pandemic, or the protection of Palestinian refugees, should be under the auspice or under the responsibility of UNRWA. Unfortunately, UNRWA already suffers from a huge budget deficit, so they're already incapacitated in terms of providing the core services that they were providing or attempting to provide before the pandemic. They have launched an urgent appeal in March of 2020 for 14 million United States dollars in order to address the pandemic within Palestinian refugee camps. Suffice it to say, the priorities that they have set for themselves basically constitute administrative procedures and a short-term approach. These measures don't equate service provision, nor meet the minimum health care requirements, nor the urgent needs of refugees to cope with the pandemic. So there is a—
You're at your time. So
Okay.
Can you begin to wrap up? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I just have a few more points. So there's an absence of a clear and systematic plan to address the spread of coronavirus among refugee communities or to deal with the economic and social consequences. There also appears to be a lack of sufficient or effective coordination between UNRWA, refugee host countries, and concerned or specialized organizations such as the World Health Organizations. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, the situation is already dire in Palestinian refugee camps all over, and the incapacity of UNRWA and their inability to function under regular circumstances with this pandemic, they're even more crippled than before. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lubnah. For those of you who joined a little bit late, that was Lubnah Shomali from Bethlehem in the West Bank, and we're going to have representatives from all the major Palestinian populations in the Middle East, from the West Bank, 1948 Israel, Gaza, and God willing from Beirut, if Jabir succeeds in unmuting himself and participating. Those are the main Palestinian populations in the Middle East, and we're very excited to hear from all of them if it works out. And just a reminder, I think all the viewers of the webinar are automatically muted, but you can ask questions. There's a button at the bottom of your screen, Q&A. Please post your questions there, and we'll have time for responding to some of them in discussion after the presentation. So thank you, Lubnah. Next, we're going to hear from Jehad, and representing Gaza, and you can introduce yourself. Thank you, Jehad.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone. Ramadan Mubarak for those fasting. Thank you for giving me the chance to join you all today and represent the Gaza aspect of today's conversation. However, I live in Boston, so it's a pleasure to be at least virtually with a lot of the great people from the community here who are active and who do this amazing work. I left Gaza 7 years ago I moved to New York to start a PhD program in history at New York University, where I study pre-1948 Palestinian intellectual history. And I also work with the American Friends Service Committee, Palestine Activism Program. And my main focus with AFSC is a campaign called Gaza Unlocked, which you can find more details about by visiting gazaunlocked.org. Adding to what Lubnah said, and Lubnah did an amazing job explaining the structural and overall picture and the structural challenges that are created as a result of years of decades of settler colonialism, occupation, and economic de-development and impoverishment of various Palestinian communities who live in different places. To talk about Gaza's experience specifically, I would like to remind us that this is the year, according to the United Nations and according to many international organizations and experts, and local as well, this was the year in which Gaza, or this is the year in which Gaza is declared unlivable. And Gaza has been long unlivable. If you look at the conditions there, if you look at the current conditions, even the previous conditions, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are barely capable of getting their heads above water. It's been a really challenging experience for Palestinians in Gaza just to deal with the consequences and the aftermath and the results of the 13-year blockade that started in 2007, but also with the results of the multiple military operations that we just witnessed in the past 10 years. But when I talk about the experience of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, I would also, it's important to highlight that the long history that led to making Gaza the way it is today and shaping its current experience. So Gaza, 2020 is supposed to be the year in which Gaza is declared unlivable. And in light of the coronavirus spread and the current conditions that are the further aggravation of occupation and control and crackdown on Palestinian rights, all of the problems of the blockade and occupation are entangled and heightened in Gaza's health sector. So, we have a severe water crisis, an extreme power shortage, high rates of unemployment, crumbling infrastructure. Freedom of movement is still a big issue. I left Gaza in summer 2013, and I haven't been able to go back ever since. I haven't seen my family for almost 7 years. And this is just part of the overall picture, the reality that people there experience. If we want to talk about whether Gaza is prepared for a COVID-19 breakout, the answer is definitely not. The Gaza Strip has a total number of 2,895 hospital beds. That's 1.3 beds per 1,000 people. The Gaza Strip has 50 to 60 ventilators for adults. Part of this number is regularly used for non-coronavirus cases. Recently, the head of the World Health Organization's sub-office in Gaza, Abdel Nasser Subuh, warned that the Gaza Strip is only prepared to handle the first 100 cases of the virus. And after that, we don't know what the situation will look like. And in fact, there have been coronavirus cases in the Gaza Strip. Thankfully, the cases have been identified and isolated and quarantined at the borders with Egypt, or for those who travel through the Erez crossing, the Erez checkpoint between the Gaza Strip and what is today Israel. But there is a limited capacity for the healthcare sector because of the blockade and because of the structural issues, the overall structural issues that the Gaza Strip and the rest of the occupied territories and other parts of the world where Palestinians are at disadvantage and are discriminated against suffer. And as a result of the blockade, since 2018 alone, more than around 40,000 Palestinians have left the Gaza Strip. And here we're talking about a population of young, educated, university graduate population that left searching for work, searching for better opportunities, trying to build their lives, escaping the high levels of unemployment. We're talking about 60% unemployment rates amongst youth and 50% unemployment rates in general. And the immigration of those young people has caused a huge gap also in the medical personnel in the Gaza Strip. But all of these, issues and problems in Gaza's case, and also in the case of other refugee camps in the West Bank or Lebanon or in other parts of the world, and in the case of the refugee experience in general, all of these problems, there is another issue that is added to them that also could fuel a mass spread of the virus if it happens, and make the situation worse for the populations that that will be a victim of that. And here we're talking about the problem of population density. At this point, it's clear that crowded conditions can increase the likelihood of people transmitting infectious diseases, and that's why social distancing is a major factor in preventing the spread of the disease. However, it's really hard to imagine how that will work in the case of refugee camps. When we talk about the Gaza Strip, it's important to remember that there is a severe and pressing population density crisis in the Gaza Strip. Here we're talking about an average of 6,000 persons living per 1 square kilometer.
Jehad, 2 minutes.
Okay. We're talking about a situation where you have a refugee camp like Jabalia, for example, in the northern Gaza Strip, where more than 140,000 Palestinian refugees live in an area of half a square mile. These numbers make it almost impossible for social distancing measures to be put in place, especially for families that live in overcrowded conditions. So in the shadow of the pandemic, there are two issues that I think we need to address. We need to address the short-term needs of Palestinians on the ground, and this is how part of my work at AFSC now is to get people to support a Gaza appeal that we have, an urgent appeal, where we provide hygiene and health products for the elderly, which is the most vulnerable population in Gaza. And at the same time, the other important issue that is important to highlight is the Palestinian refugee issue, because in situations like this, in a pandemic or in natural disasters, the refugee population is always the population that is at most risk and the most vulnerable. And in the case of Palestine, we must ask the question: how did we get to a situation where you have 140,000 Palestinians, for example, in Jabalia refugee camp, trapped in a 1 square kilometer refugee camp, in a situation where you have people living on top of each other just because they have to pay the price for maintaining Israel's demographic reality as it is. So those two issues, Palestinian refugees and the short-term needs, I think this should be on the agenda, and I think these are the most pressing topics to address in our conversation and further ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Jehad. Again, for those of you who joined late, we heard from the West Bank and now Gaza, and I'd like to introduce my friend Thabet Abu Ras to speak for the Palestinian community that lives in 1948 Israel. Thabet, go ahead, please.
Shukran, Jeff. Hello, everybody. Thank you for your time, for the emotional space you are giving us to talk about our problems nowadays. I'm Thabet Abu Ras. I'm a political geographer. I got my PhD from University of Arizona. I am a political and NGO activist today and a lecturer at Beersheba University. Well, the pandemic is a global and crossing borders. It doesn't differentiate really between people, between classes, and between genders and colors, nationality. Yet it severely hit local income people, local income classes, and poor people. The Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics shows that over 50% of the total Arab Palestinian families in Israel is under poverty line. So the Palestinians inside Israel is more vulnerable than the Jewish community. There are many reasons for that. I would like to mention a couple of them. First of all, unstable employment. Most Arabs are working in blue-collar jobs in the public and private sector inside Israel. low level of emergency preparedness. There is a lack of experience in logistics and the crisis management in the Palestinian towns. The majority of previous national emergencies inside Israel have been in a context of conflict, and we are not part of that at all. We can add there's lack of trust in the Israeli government. It's something historical. And the coronavirus that really now hitting the Palestinian community inside Israel reached us 2 to 3 weeks later. This is because the corona testing started in the Arab community, in the Palestinian community, 2 to 3 weeks later. The situation today, so the government really in Israel talks about exit strategy and starts to return to routine. Some Arab Palestinian towns are in the top of the list of the towns in Israel in the spread of the virus, exactly right now. While some Israeli officials in Israeli government announced that apparently we are a current wave has exhausted itself, officials and the Palestinian experts believe that the Palestinian community, the peak inside the Arab towns, the Palestinian towns, is ahead of us. There are mixed messages that comes from the Israeli government. Since Ramadan month, very communal month, a lot of activities, religious and social activities taking place, the government of Israel has decided to use harsher measures during this month, including totally close of businesses starting at 7:30 p.m. until 3 a.m. in the early morning, and preventing any outdoors activities in Arab towns. Yet it has decided to reopen schools. So there is a lot of confusion in the Palestinian community of Israel because of the mixed messages. This is why the Palestinian families are refusing to send their kids to schools today. The Association of Arab Mayors, it's an umbrella organization of all Arab municipalities, started a strike today, opened a strike today, when the climax of the epidemic is expected to reach Arab Palestinian society in the coming week, exactly in the coming week. So we are actually two communities, different communities with different behavior, while you have one government dictating everything without taking in consideration always the Palestinian community inside Israel. Another example of confusion is giving permission to 19 worshippers to pray together, to get together communal prayer. The permission intended for Jewish worshippers actually, without saying that clearly, this permission for Jews only. Muslims are required to keep their mosque shut. So there is a really mixed messages here. The challenges we are facing in Ramadan, are how to convince people to continue to stay in their homes. Notice they obeyed the instructions of the Ministry of Health and stayed home so far, and how they have to continue another 30 days when the Jews are slowly leaving their homes to routine. Some Muslim worshippers begin to reach the closest mosques and pray outside the plaza, in the yard of the mosque actually. For Muslims, prayer is more desirable to be communal, in the communal way, and not prayer at home. Issues of major concern in the Palestinian communities in Israel include ratifying the mandate of the Shin Bet, the Israeli secret intelligence, to monitor the movement of citizens, all citizens in Israel, by technological means through mobile phones. apparently the government actually doing everything it could to keep the Shin Bet as the only possibility to follow and even expand the activities of this intelligence agency. Palestinian citizens may pay higher. Another challenge actually, the fact that the Palestinian citizen may pay higher price of the corona crisis. Today, over 1.1 million workers, unemployed people, citizens of Israel, sitting in their homes. We know that a high percentage of them are blue-collar industrial and service workers. Well, very high percentage of the Arabs really working in these sectors. These are mainly Palestinians. Unfortunately, Arabs are not high-tech workers who can work from home. So they can pay a higher price. Discrimination in government compensation to local government, also in taxes. Right now, the government decided to pay some compensation to municipalities for shutting down to businesses, and the Arabs are getting only 1.7% of the total amount allocated for all municipalities, okay? Palestinian Arabs making up 20% of the total population, yet they are getting only 1.7% of the total amount of compensation.
Thabet, it's 2 minutes to go.
Okay, thank you. Also, right now, there is a lot of need for credits and banking services. Lack of credit and banking services in the Arab community is it's very limited, actually. Sometimes non-existent. The black market is thriving. It is already thriving, actually, and the police are not giving a real answer to this issue of black market. The Negev area, the Palestinian Bedouin of the Negev really is a good example. There are no banks in the whole region of the Bedouin community except in Rahat, a city of Rahat. Outside of Rahat, we are talking about 260,000 Bedouin living in the Negev, no banking services. So there is a need for a quick response, financial relief, grants, deferring payments, and this kind of things. And we really, there's kind of frustration of the consequences of prolonged sitting at home. It will known for everywhere. Already we are aware of an increase in domestic violence and violence in general in Palestinian society also. And one more general last concern, the densely populated living conditions in the Arab Palestinian towns, and that so many people work in hospitals. There is a higher percentage of Palestinians working in Israeli hospitals. Around 30% of the total workers in the hospitals, it's not only doctors and nurses who are talking about, the administrative staff are Arabs. And this is a major source of concern because many of those who really infected infections came from the hospitals. Thank you.
Thank you, Thabet. Again, for those who joined late, this is the first in a series of webinars organized by the Palestine-Israel Working Group of Massachusetts Peace Action. Cole, maybe you can put that page on the screen. The second one will be November 17th, and it will center around the Al Jazeera documentary about the Israel lobby in the United States, which was censored and not allowed to be shown by Al Jazeera because of pressure from the Israel lobby in the US. So we were expecting and hoping to hear from Jehad Suleiman from Beirut, representing the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the refugee community in Lebanon. He was with us briefly and then disappeared. And as some of you know, if you're familiar with the situation in Beirut, electricity and Wi-Fi are very unreliable, and and we're sorry that we lost Jabir from this conversation. But maybe I'd ask Lubnah, who is in touch with that community, to maybe report a little bit about the situation among the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and then anyone else who cares to can chime in. And a reminder that you can post questions through on that button at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A button, and we'll have a little time for discussion after the presentation. So Lubnah, if you want to start it off, and anyone else who has experience among the refugee community in Beirut and Lebanon can add their comments if they choose to. So Lubnah.
Thanks again, Jeff. Really, that's sad that we couldn't hear from Jabir. He is actually living in Lebanon, so he would provide much more reliable information than me, but I'll go ahead and take a stab at it. In about October of 2018, the Lebanese government decided to reinforce or re-implement a labor law that basically impacted what they call foreigners. Now, unfortunately, Palestinian refugees who are in Lebanon are not necessarily considered refugees by the Lebanese government. They are treated as foreigners, and so the legislation within Lebanese law that applies to foreigners applies to them. Now, what this law basically did is it further crippled Palestinians in terms of economic opportunity. There are a significant number of occupations that Palestinians cannot occupy, that they cannot be. So if they studied, for example, to be a doctor, then they can't practice medicine in Lebanon. If they studied to be an engineer, then they can't practice engineering or that sort of thing. So there's a number of positions that they can't have. Of course, this has contributed to their socioeconomic decline and suppression. Compound to that the fact that they are very restricted in terms of their movement and their ability to own property. So the vast majority of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon live in refugee camps. The estate of the infrastructure and the service provision within these refugee camps is horrible. I have heard people say that by comparison, if we look at the refugee camps in Bethlehem, talking about Aida and Tesha, I mean, we know that there are no walk in the park, but the situation in Lebanon is much more dire. Then we had the uprisings in Lebanon and the corruption, the prevalent corruption within the government, and the fact that the government was bankrupt. So this, of course, further marginalized population. And then, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. What BADIL has done in order to try to provide support to the Palestinian refugee communities in Lebanon is that we have initiated a number of initiatives to provide the necessary material goods, like, for example, hand sanitizer, gloves, masks, disinfectants, and cleaning products. So we have engaged with a number of local organizations within the refugee camps and a number of contacts that we have in order to provide this kind of support. As I mentioned earlier, the situation with UNRWA, particularly in Lebanon, when there is a need for UNRWA to not only coordinate with the Lebanese government, but also pressure the Lebanese government in order to facilitate or to open up spaces for INGOs and UNRWA to do their work. This is not happening. And with host governments already unprepared and backlogged and burdened by providing these types of services and these types of materials to their own citizens, certainly the Palestinian refugees are not a priority for them. I think that's all I can really say on Lebanon. I apologize that I don't have more, but if there are questions, then perhaps I'd be able to be more useful that way.
Yeah, I'm going to ask for comments from anyone else who has experienced the refugee communities in Lebanon. I would just add that the already miserable conditions in especially the urbanized refugee camps around Beirut, Shatila, and Burj al-Barajneh are now exacerbated by the influx of thousands of refugees from the war in Syria who've moved into these because they're the cheapest places in Beirut and the most miserable places to live in Beirut. And now those refugee camps are even more crowded than they were before. So does anyone else have a comment about the refugees in Lebanon?
Well, if I can ask well, first, thank you so much to all of you for these incredible presentations. I want to ask, especially Lubnah and Jehad, to just highlight the challenges that you guys are facing. We know that in terms of the occupation, you have the international communities participating in making it hard for you to do your job in terms of the restrictions on funds, for example, and the conditioned resources from the European Unions, which they are, taking the steps of the US aid. But also, if you can tell us here, if you can say something about that, and tell us here what can we do to help, not only politically, with our political work here in terms of, legislatives, et cetera, but also in terms of resource. This is a really critical time, especially for the one in Lebanon and Gaza, to help. But I know the West Bank also struggling. To what kind of help can we provide here in this crisis, and just direct us to the best way to do that, because we know that a lot of resources has been going and missing within the nonprofit world everywhere. So please comment on that if you can.
Sure. Should I go first, Jehad, or would you like to go first?
No, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I do want to say one more thing about the situation of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and this goes to your comment, Jeff. You said that there is a surplus of refugees, or there has been an influx of refugees from Syria. Some of them, the vast majority of them, Syrian refugees, because of course Palestinian refugees were prevented from fleeing the war in Syria, and Lebanon actually prevented them from seeking refuge in Lebanon. Unlike Palestinian refugees, Syrian refugees fall under the umbrella of UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And UNHCR, unlike UNRWA, has two powers, or let's say two capacities within its mandate that UNRWA doesn't have. One is that they can actually lobby and pressure states. So UNHCR has more authority granted to it by the UN in order to pressure Lebanon into providing services for the refugees that fall under their mandate, and in this case, Syrian refugees. Now, this is not to say that the situation of Syrian refugees is not dire. I just mean to highlight the fact, as Jehad said, that since Palestinian refugees already suffer from a protection gap, they're already marginalized, we have the superimposition of another layer of marginalization and discrimination. Going to your question, Nadal, the funds for Palestinian NGOs who are doing human rights work and good work is drying up. And this is because of the imposition of politically conditional funding on Palestinian organizations. Organizations are struggling to maintain their identity and their commitment to our national principles because of the imposition of these political conditions by donor governments and donor organizations. And of course, you mentioned the EU, and the EU is definitely following on the cusp of the United States and the way that they have limited funding through the imposition or under the cloak of the imposition of anti-terrorism legislation. What the EU has done is inserted a new clause that of course they claim is not new, but it actually is new, or at least the imposition of this clause is new, that basically labels 7 different Palestinian political factions as terrorist organizations, and also requires Palestinian recipient organizations to vet the people that they work with. The vetting procedure is not just for the organization's head management or the organization's leadership, like the General Assembly or the Board of Directors. It trickles all the way down to the beneficiaries of the project. So this is going to greatly limit and handicap the types of actions and the types of work that we can do. In addition to that, every single Palestinian on the planet is politically oriented. Now, the degree of their political orientation differs. It doesn't necessarily mean that if I say a Palestinian is politically oriented, that they absolutely belong to one political faction or another. But historically speaking, our people and our movement is political. So this kind of funding basically criminalizes all Palestinians, regardless of the fact that we can say that there are seven political entities on the list. This doesn't mean also that these lists won't change and there won't be other additional Palestinian factions put on the agenda. Or put on the lists. Just to give you an example, BADIL submitted a project proposal to the European Union late in 2018. We received approval for that project, which is in the neighborhood of $1.2 million, or I'm sorry, 1.2 million euros over 3 years. The project has been put on hold because we are refusing to sign the contract that has the clause with the politically conditional funding in it. We have launched a campaign to try to combat this. Unfortunately, these measures are not only taken by the EU, by what we would even call progressive European states. For example, Sweden, the Swedish International Development Agency, which is the main Swedish agency that provides funds to Palestinian organizations and to organizations in Palestine, has also instituted a conditional funding clause. Denmark, also a traditionally a progressive country in terms of Palestine, claims to have a human rights-based approach. Also is implementing a complete anti-terrorism policy. So these donors or these agencies that we have traditionally relied upon to fund our projects and give us the funds that we need to use, that we need in order to be able to do our work, are slowly defunding us based on these under the as I said, under the umbrella of combating terrorism. None of these countries or the arguments that they are posing is that, for example, the EU says that this is a global policy, that it's being implemented in all countries the same. Well, this is not the case here in Palestine, because in Palestine we have a very specific condition. We are a people under occupation and oppression. We have settler colonialism, we have apartheid, which means that we have the right to resist with legitimate means, and this includes armed resistance. And this resistance is not terrorism. Unfortunately, what is happening is that this is furthering the stereotype that Palestinian resistance is terrorism, regardless of whether it is armed or non-armed resistance. So Palestinian organizations are having a difficult time holding on to staff because of the reduced funding. The scope and the sector in which they work, the type of projects that they're able to do is also limited. Add to this the restrictions on being able to transfer money. So for example, when we implemented our initiatives in Lebanon, we had a very difficult time ensuring that the funds got to the organizations that we wanted to implement our supportive initiatives. So it's creating a very dire situation for organizations here in Palestine.
So Jehad, you were going to comment, and Thabet and Nidal, feel free to follow up on that. So Jehad?
Yeah, thank you so much. So to answer Nidal's question, in terms of what can be done politically and in the broader picture of our activism and advocacy, I think a significant momentum has been established in the US, especially on the level of congressional work, and where, you know, there has been unprecedented interest in advocating for Palestine, not only on a grassroots level, but by translating the grassroots work into constituent pressure to change policies. And we also that in the campaign No Way to Treat a Child, which AFSC has been a leading organization in pushing that campaign. So it stands as a proof of what does it mean to create grassroots work, but also culminating that with advocacy work. And definitely, I mean, this COVID-19 moment that we are experiencing will have numerous implications on freedoms, on liberties. It will increase and strengthen the grip of state power and control. And in the context of people who live under occupation or live under, you know, the rule of tyrannical regimes and so on and so forth, the suffering of these communities will surely increase as a result of the amount of power that these you know, regimes and systems of control are enjoying as a result of this moment. In the case of Palestine, I think the next big challenge for us as organizers, as activists, as people who you know, have been doing this work for years, is to pay attention to the annexation issue. Annexation now is perhaps the #1 item on the agenda for Israeli policymakers and decision makers. And it does seem that it's not a question of whether they're going to annex parts of the West Bank, but when. This will have significant implications on our work and how we do it, and how it reflects on our overall activism, not only for freedom, self-determination, and rights for Palestinians in Palestine, but as a broader movement that seeks to achieve these things for Palestinians and non-Palestinians alike. Now, in terms of the of short-term pressing urgent things that can be done, I'm going to share AFSC's a link to AFSC's Gaza appeal in the chat, which will be available to all panelists and attendees to check out. And we launched this appeal to support the elderly people in Gaza, who are the most vulnerable and exposed segment of the population to the risks that come with a COVID-19 spread if it happens. And with this appeal, our volunteers, as you all know, of course, AFSC has been working in Gaza and in other parts of Palestine and inside Israel since 1948. We have been doing a lot of relief and humanitarian work, in addition to highlighting the political work as well, and to shed light on the need to achieve a just solution that is rooted in justice and fairness, and that addresses the plight of the Palestinian people in a serious manner. So with this appeal, we provide hygiene products, we provide hand sanitizer, alcohol wipes, and informational pamphlets and brochures to marginalized elderly communities so that they can be prepared with the minimum in case of a COVID-19 spread. And soon our appeal will expand to include parts of Area C, where people are unable to access urban centers as a result of checkpoints and as a result of the different obstacles that the occupation creates. Another link here shows photos of the distribution of the materials by our volunteers. And AFSC is one of the few American organizations that can bring this kind of support directly from people here who want to help and support. So I encourage people to support us in our work and also follow our political and advocacy work, which we do, especially an upcoming Unlocking Gaza seminar, which will be announced soon in the Massachusetts area, but also and in the New England area, but also nationwide.
Thank you, Jehad. So Thabet and Nidal, if you want to comment. And speaking of annexation, Thabet, where you live is maybe planned to be de-annexed to Israel. You can comment on that.
Well, the political situation in Israel is really very, very tough. Nowadays, today actually, the Supreme Court just started to look to the case of Netanyahu if it's to cancel the possibility for him to form a government as a corrupted person. Well, the problem in Israel right now that a corrupted and racist leader is actually leading for more Judaizing the space in the homeland, not only inside Israel, but in the homeland. And we witness more and more polarization within the Jewish community, even inside Israel. To the odds, we see Palestinians really, the Palestinian inside Israel, very united in unprecedented way. We never had this kind of unity, and I'm happy for that. Nowadays, it's not because of Ramadan only, but in large because of the coronavirus crisis, we see more and more grassroots organization, grassroots initiatives that come from the community, people helping each other. And yes, we are inside Israel, but we are Palestinian too. Unfortunately, this time we cannot reach our brothers in Gaza, especially, to try to help in Ramadan. Usually we are trying to start, we try to help in certain ways, but now because of the blockade in the West Bank and in Gaza, we cannot move around a lot.
Nidal, do you want to make a comment, especially on this issue, what we can do here in the U.S.?
Quick comment, because I'm sure if there's any questions in the Q&A from audience, we should take a few of them. But usually we say we're all in it together with this COVID-19, which is true. The whole world is in it together, but yet there are so many communities in the world who are not with it together like us. We are much fortunate here as a society, even though we have a lot in the US to care and help. But what's happening in Palestine, the US has a big hand into this mess. And we need to take responsibility politically and financially to help these communities, especially such organizations that are playing a key role in helping Palestinians in Palestine and abroad. So I'm really, to all our listeners now, check these organizations. That's the links that posted here, the AFC, the BADIL, the Thabet organization, and get in touch with them personally or with us for connections and for any support we can provide to them right now. I'm gonna go to Cole, if you have any questions from the audience.
Let me just add before we go to the questions that on the issue of what can we do here in the U.S., you know, here at Peace Action, we have a working group on Palestine and Israel. And of course, we feel a very deep solidarity with our Palestinian sisters and brothers and comrades, but we focus mainly on the issue of changing U.S. policy toward Palestine and Israel, which is actually absolutely instrumental in bolstering the apartheid regime that's growing in place in Israel, including to the tune of almost $4 billion a year of U.S. military aid to Israel. So we welcome you to participate with us, pi@masspeaceaction.org. I think it's in the chat too. And so Cole, if you can sort of put some of the questions forward.
Okay, I'll start with a very broad question by Leslie Condon. While there seems to be growing support for Palestinians in some intellectual circles, I engage with many progressive identifying Jewish Americans who refuse to acknowledge the current Palestinian apartheid, never mind discussing the issue at length. This is in contrast to our Israeli Jewish friends who are quite critical of their government. But when I try to make this point, I've been met with scorn or disbelief. Are there strategies I can use to support more productive conversations on this topic with Jewish Americans?
Well, is this question for Maba more?
I think it can go to anyone who feels they can answer it.
I don't have the answers. I mean, we're often faced with a number of unsavory comments, claiming anti-Semitism, claiming discrimination, claiming that we're terrorists. I think engaging with the Jewish Americans, and I think that that Jewish Voice for Peace has done a very good job of doing this, and I know that they have on their website a number of different types of information in order to be able to debunk certain arguments, and I think that those kinds of tools are useful. I mean, it's difficult to really put forth an argument if we don't know to answer that specifically, and put forth an argument if we don't know what the specific argument is.
Okay.
I can add to Lubnah. I believe that to engage with American Jews, it's very important to stick with the facts from the ground. And the situation in the ground is very terrible, really, especially in Gaza and the West Bank. And I believe the best track when you talk with them, it's to talk about morals, moral issue, moral principles, and to ask the people to stand for their values, for their morals. That's the whole thing.
Okay. Are the markets closed in Bethlehem so that the virus doesn't spread? Are there any cases in Bethlehem for Lubnah?
Yeah, but we have maybe about, I think, 40 or 45 cases. Most of them have been resolved. We've had a few deaths, but not necessarily in the urban areas, but more in the rural areas. The markets were closed initially, but now we have this rotating system where they are opening certain types of markets or certain types of shops on various days. So there are specific days, for example, for the pharmacies to open. There are specific days for the grocery stores to open to kind of ease back into a routine. The PNC and the PLC, the Palestinian National Council and the Palestinian Legislative Council, are meeting today and tomorrow. And there is talk that they will actually lift the state of emergency on the Bethlehem area. And this would ease the movement between Bethlehem, Beit Sahur, and Beit Jala. And we do have certain businesses, for example, like the financial institutions, the banks, that have gone back to work. But not a complete opening up of the restrictions. And we haven't had any new cases in Bethlehem for the last 3 weeks. So we feel fairly confident that we will be able to ease up a little bit on the restrictions, and people will still need to be careful, of course, but we are seeing a return to a little bit normal life, not necessarily completely normal, but we're going there a few steps at a time.
Okay, and from Eva Mosley, she asks, is it possible to donate to UNRWA in US dollars? I've given to UNHCR, but didn't realize the limitations.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, they have an urgent appeal right now for 14 million USD. Unfortunately, they've only been able to raise about 30%. 30% of the 14 million. And as I said, this 14 million is basically preventative. It's not a long-term strategy, and it's not necessarily a program that they have put forth to actually tackle the more rigorous impacts of COVID, but just to provide refugee camps with a little bit of support in order to deter infection or prevent infection. But yes, definitely you can donate to UNRWA in USD. And I can't remember the name of the appeal, but maybe I'll try to find the link and send it to you sometime later so that you can have that.
Cole, you're muted.
Sorry. As for Lebanon, Masudeh Edmond asks, what is the population of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon? Do any Arab countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt help?
The Palestinian population, the Palestinian refugee population in Lebanon, according to BADIL, is somewhere around 450,000 refugees scattered across Lebanon. Up until recently, the vast majority of these refugees actually resided in refugee camps. But because of the dire situations in those refugee camps, some refugees have been internally displaced within Lebanon, particularly with the impact and the burden that has been caused by other refugee inflows, like Syrian refugees from Syria because of the crisis. What was the second question? I forgot.
Are any Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt helping the refugees in Lebanon?
Yes, actually. The Trump administration, part of its delegitimization of UNRWA, has pressured Arab countries to provide funding. And the Arab countries have responded. I'm not sure about Egypt, but for sure Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, this is not how we want things to go, because the Palestinian refugee issue is an international responsibility. And this was a burden, or this was a responsibility that UNRWA, or that the UN recognized, and this is why they created UNRWA. So the fact that Arab countries are being pressured into providing support, countries that are already burdened in terms of hosting refugees like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, etc., they're also being asked to bear even more burden. And so this should be kept in mind when we talk about who should be funding UNRWA, or who should be providing those funds or that kind of core budget for this UN mandated agency, this international agency that was actually created because of the international community's responsibility and partial responsibility in creating the Palestinian refugee population in the first place.
Okay, and Chris Affleck asks, how will annexation affect life on the ground in the West Bank? What actions and positions are being taken by Palestinian community in the West Bank in regards to this? And how are supporters inside the 48 Israel responding to this?
I'll answer the part about the impact of the annexation. We're already in a situation of de facto annexation. What we're seeing now is a push towards de jure annexation, which basically means instead of a situation of annexation just on the ground, practically, we're also going to see it at a legal level. And this is why the agreement that came about during the Israeli coalition government to push forth annexation through the Israeli Knesset, this is why it's a big issue, because as of the 1st of July, they are going to push this de facto annexation into de jure annexation. What that means is that we'll see more refugees. Palestinians are going to be forced from their places of origin and habitual residence, either for the first time or for multiple times, because many of those communities within Area C, where the annexation is going to, or the most immediate de jure annexation is going to take place, already those populations, many significant portions of those populations are already refugees or internally displaced persons within the West Bank. And so it's a way to squeeze out the Palestinian population out of Area C and force them into areas A and B. So the entrenchment of the annexation is what we're going to see. In terms of what we are doing on the ground, BADIL has a program to provide community resilience initiatives to different villages in Area C. These are very small humanitarian aid and infrastructure. I wouldn't necessarily say infrastructure, but very small type of projects like opening up agricultural roads or providing water pumps or installing solar panels that provide the essential services that are not being provided neither by Israel nor the Palestinian Authority in these areas, that enhance or increase the resilience of communities in this area, and hopefully will enhance their sumud or their steadfastness so that they stay. The presence of Palestinians in Area C is what irks Israel the most, or in all of Palestine for that matter, because I know this is the case also inside 48. And so the ultimate goal, regardless of the mechanism that Israel uses, is to control the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians. So what we try to do is we try to enhance the resilience of these communities within the means that we have available to us.
So we've gone a bit over from what we expected, but and thank you for all the questions. I want to give the other panelists a chance for a final brief comment before we sign off. Thabet, Nidal, Jehad, if you have some final comments, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I just would like to say that we are opposing annexation of the Area C. We don't think that the forthcoming government of Israel, led by Netanyahu, will stop with Area C. Actually, they have in their mind some of the crazy plans for the Palestinians. We will see more Judizing the space all over Palestine, more free land, yes, for settlers. And they just, it's not gonna do any good with us. It will enhance apartheid within the state of Israel. And we will see more and more restrictions in movement of Palestinians all over. I think that the Palestinian towns in the West Bank will become like what's going on right now in Gaza. So we really oppose that. We don't think it's good neither for Jews nor for the Arabs. Still, the issue of self-determination for the Palestinian, it's the most important issue. We are inside Israel, Palestinian inside Israel. We feel we are part of the Palestinian people. We would like to see our people have their own independent and sovereign state. And I just mentioned that in terms of our unity, we are very united inside Israel here. All political parties in one joint list, working together, opposing occupation, opposing apartheid, and sometimes demanding equality inside Israel. Israel is defining itself as a Jewish state, and you know what's that mean for us. We are actually neither second or third class citizens we are, because we are different groups in Israel. So Israel is gearing toward being more racist society and more actually opposing Palestinians, and it's a really problem for us in the future. Unity of the Palestinian people can help in the future, coming future, and hopefully the Palestinian people will work for unity, especially Gaza, West Bank, first of all. Thanks.
Thank you, Thabet. Jehad, final comments?
Quickly, I just, again, want to thank all the panelists. I feel like we have so much to learn from you guys, and I will make sure to have you over and over again to learn more from you. I just feel like we are going to wake up from this pandemic into a new old reality in Palestine, where again the US and Europe are playing a major role in it. And we'll rely on you, Lubnah, Jehad, Thabet, and everyone in Palestine to really this time lead us and direct us on what needs to be done in Palestine. And here is going to be more responsibilities on us to do more political work. So I'll leave it to Jehad now.
Thank you, Nidal, and thanks everyone. It's been really a great pleasure to join this conversation today. There isn't anything else that I would like to add, but to thank everyone and to emphasize that our struggles are intertwined and connected. And Palestine has been a stage where an injustice and discrimination and inequality and deprivation of rights have been tolerated by the international community, and there have been great work to put an end to this, but the situation has continued and still continues to deteriorate for many communities. I think in the shadow of COVID-19, Palestine remains and will continue as one of the world's stages for addressing these problems that are not about Palestine itself, but rather they are problems that go beyond Palestine, the problems of economic and social inequality, discrimination, lack of access to resources and unfair distribution of resources, and so on and so forth. Our work, if we manage to create progress in Palestine, this will not only reflect on the lives of Palestinians, me, my family, Nidal's family, and so on and so forth, but this will create a better world for everyone. So I wanted to end on this note, and hope is definitely a rare commodity these days, so we need a lot of it, and us being together gives me so much hope. So thanks everyone, and thanks for inviting me, and it was really a pleasure to be on this call.
Okay, thanks so much to all our panelists, and for those of you who joined us online, a reminder that you'll be receiving a follow-up email indicating where the video of this webinar will be posted online that you can share, and that our next webinar on the Israel lobby in the US will be on the 17th of this month, and we hope you'll all join us again. And please, you're welcome to join us in our work in changing US policy, which underlies everything bad that's happening in Palestine. So thanks so much, and we hope to see you again soon. And best wishes for all of you who are observing Ramadan. And talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.